Chapter 6. The High Plains of Eden. Angie and her sister, along with some of the other girls of the Sib, crowded around the doorway into the chapel. The cowhide covering that usually hid the interior from view had been removed. This was the time of the fall festival celebrating the bounty of the great goddess. The great women of the city, their hair greased back, their breasts and thighs covered with the gray-blue color of ceremonial ash, were kneeling and singing around the festooned and tranced figure of the goddess. She was resplendent, lying on the horn recliner with bunches of flowers and offerings of pine nuts heaped about her. Watching through the flickering of many lamps, the young observers never so much as imagined that what they saw was not the goddess herself, her pregnant form rising and falling in deep sleep, but a wooden statue inset with the fine obsidian for which the city was famous, and rubbed with generations of pigments and fat until her skin shone with the same deep ebony luster as that of the city's people. In a small open space at the foot of the goddess, 3 of the shamans of the highest, most secret order danced slowly in vulture costumes, whose shadows mingled hypnotically with similar vultures painted on the whitewashed walls. At the conclusion of the dance, richly painted wood vessels with lids were brought from a niche in the wall and unwrapped from covers of dyed and woven fabric. Everyone present, even our little spies at the doorway, knew that the mushroom, she of many names, was within, and the sacrament was brought forth and distributed to be eaten among the women present. It was a rare privilege for the girls to be ignored and so allowed to witness the Harvest Mother mysteries, a mark of their rising status with the women, really. Each knew that in a few years she would take her place as an initiate into the ritual which they now beheld but could not understand. Though she was only 8 and her sister Slinga was 6, Angie knew that what they saw no man of the city had ever seen. The men's mysteries were different, also secret, also never spoken of. The Tassili Plateau. Archaeological evidence for these speculative ideas can be found in the Sahara Desert of southern Algeria, in an area called the Tassili Najir Plateau. A curious geological formation, the plateau is like a labyrinth, a vast badlands of stone escarpments that have been cut by the wind into many perpendicular narrow corridors. Aerial photographs give the eerie impression of an abandoned city. In the Tassili Najir, rock paintings date from the late Neolithic to as recently as 2,000 years ago. Here are the earliest known depictions of shamans with large numbers of grazing cattle. The shamans are dancing with fists full of mushrooms and also have mushrooms sprouting out of their bodies. In one instance, they are shown running joyfully, surrounded by the geometric structures of their hallucinations. The pictorial evidence seems incontrovertible. Images similar to those of the Tassili occur in pre-Columbian Peruvian textiles. In these textiles, the shamans hold objects that may be mushrooms, but may also be chopping tools. With the Tassili frescoes, however, the case is clear. At Madeleine Amazar and Tien Tazarift on the Tassili, the dancing shamans clearly have mushrooms in their hands and sprouting from their bodies. The pastoral peoples who produced the Tassili paintings gradually moved out of Africa over a long period of time, from 20,000 to 7,000 years ago. Wherever they went, their pastoral lifestyle went with them. The Red Sea was landlocked during much of this time. Lowered sea levels meant that the boot of Arabia was backed up against the African continent. Land bridges at both ends of the Red Sea were utilized by some of these African pastoralists to enter the Fertile Crescent and Asia Minor, where they intermingled with hunter-gatherer populations already present. The pastoral mode has been well established across the ancient Near East by 12,000 years ago. These pastoral people brought with them a cult of cattle and a cult of the great goddess. The evidence that they had such cults comes from rock paintings in the Tassili Najir that are from what scholars have named the Roundhead period. This period is named for the style of depiction of the human figure in these paintings, a style not known from any other site. The Roundhead Civilization. The Roundhead period is believed to have begun early and probably ended before the 7th millennium BP. Henry Lote estimates that the Roundhead period lasted several thousand years, placing its beginning somewhere near the start of the 9th millennium. That the great goddess was part of the worldview of the Roundhead-style painters is beyond dispute. A painting from Ineo Honorhat in the Tassili includes a wonderful image of a dancing woman. With her outstretched arms and horns extended horizontally on either side of her head, she is the embodiment of the great horned goddess. Her discoverer saw her as having a relationship with the Egyptian great goddess Isis, mythical protector of the cultivation of grain. This impressive figure highlights one of the many problems raised by the Tassili finds. Why, if done at a time when the stratigraphy of the Nile Valley shows it to have been nearly deserted, do many of the paintings of the Roundhead period show an unmistakable Egyptian influence in content and style? The logical conclusion is that these motifs and stylistic conceits that we associate with ancient Egypt were first introduced into Egypt by the dwellers of the Western Desert. If proven, this suggestion would indicate the Central Sahara as the source of what later became the high civilization of pre-dynastic Egypt. Paradise found? The Tassili Najir of 12,000 BC may well have been the partnership paradise whose loss has created one of the most persistent and poignant of our mythological motifs, the nostalgia for paradise, the idea of a lost golden age of plenty, partnership, and social balance. The contention here is that the rise of language, partnership society, and complex religious ideas may have occurred not far from the area where humans emerged, the game-filled, mushroom-dotted grasslands and savannas of tropical and subtropical Africa. There the partnership society arose and flourished. There hunter-gatherer culture slowly gave way to domestication of animals and plants. In this milieu the psilocybin-containing mushrooms were encountered, consumed, and deified. Language, poetry, ritual, and thought emerged from the darkness of the hominid mind. Eden was not a myth. For the prehistoric peoples of the high plateau of the Tassili Najir, Eden was home. The end of that story may well be the beginning of our own. Is it mere coincidence that at the beginning of the source code of Western civilization, in the book of Genesis, we read an account of history's first drug bust? Chapter 3, verse 6. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good to eat, and that it was pleasing to the eye and pleasing to contemplate, she took some and ate it. She also gave her husband some, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they discovered that they were naked. So they stitched fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. Chapter 3, verse 22. The Lord God made tunics of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. He said, "The man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. What if he now reaches out his hand and takes fruit from the tree of life also, eats it, and lives forever?" So the Lord God drove him out of the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he had been taken. He cast him out, and to the east of the Garden of Eden he stationed the cherubim and a sword whirling and flashing to guard the way to the tree of life. The story of Genesis is the story of a woman who is mistress of the magical plants. She eats and shares the fruits of the tree of life, or the tree of knowledge, fruits which are pleasing to the eye and pleasing to contemplate. Note that the eyes of both of them were opened, and they discovered that they were naked. At the metaphorical level, they had attained consciousness of themselves as individuals, and of each other as other. So the fruit of the tree of knowledge gave accurate insights, or perhaps it enhanced their appreciation of sensuality. Whichever the case, this ancient story of our ancestors being cast out of a garden by a spiteful and insecure Jehovah, a storm god, is the story of a goddess-oriented partnership society thrown into disequilibrium by successive episodes of drought that affected the carrying capacity and climate of the pastoralist Saharan Eden. The angel with the flashing sword who guards the return to Eden seems an obvious symbol of the unforgiving harshness of the desert sun and the severe drought conditions that accompany it. Tension between male and female is close to the surface in this story, and indicates that at the time the story was first recorded, the change from partnership to dominator-style cultures was already well advanced. The woman ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. This mysterious fruit is the psilocybin-containing mushroom Stropharia cubensis that catalyzed the Tassili partnership Eden and then maintained it through a religion that placed a premium on frequent dissolution of personal boundaries into the oceanic presence of the great goddess, who is also called Gaia, G, the earth. John Pfeiffer, in discussing the Upper Paleolithic cave art of Europe, makes a number of observations that are important for these ideas. He believes that the placement of art within the caves and often nearly inaccessible spots is related to the use of the sites for initiation ceremonies that involved quite complex theatrical effects. He further suggests that what he calls Twilight state thinking is a precondition to having great culturally sanctioned truths revealed. Twilight state thinking is characterized by a loss of objectivity, temporal distortion, and a tendency to experience mild hallucinations, and is nothing more than a gloss for egoless and unbounded psychedelic arousal. The presence of twilight state thinking, our very susceptibility to the condition, argues for its evolutionary importance. In extreme cases, it results in pathology, derangements and delusions, persisting hallucinations, and fanaticism. But it is also the driving force behind efforts to see things whole, to achieve a variety of syntheses from unified field theories in physics to blueprints for utopias in which people live together in peace. There must have been an enormous selective premium on the twilight state during prehistoric times. If the pressures of the Upper Paleolithic demanded fervid belief and the following of leaders for survival's sake, then individuals endowed with such qualities, with a capacity to fall readily into trances, would out-reproduce more resistant individuals. Pfeiffer neglects to discuss psychoactive plants and any role they might have played in bringing about twilight thought, and he limits his discussion to Europe. However, the placement of the Tassili rock paintings is similar to that of paintings in many of the European sites, and so it can be presumed that the paintings were used for generally similar purposes. Most likely, similar religious rites were practiced across southern Europe and North Africa. The retreat of the glaciers from the Eurasian landmass and the simultaneous acceleration of aridity in the African grasslands eventually brought the casting out of Eden allegorically conveyed in Genesis. The mushroom peoples of Tassili Najir began to move east of Eden, and in fact it is possible to trace this migration in the archaeological record. A missing link culture. In the middle of the 10th millennium BC, Palestine, which had been only lightly populated, was the site of the sudden appearance of a remarkably advanced culture that brought with it an explosion in the size of settlements and in arts, crafts, and technologies, such as had never before been seen in the Near East, or for that matter, anywhere on this planet. This is the Natufian culture, whose crescent moon flints and elegantly naturalistic carved bonework are unrivaled by anything contemporary found in Europe. As James Mellart writes, there is in the early Natufian a love of art, sometimes naturalistic, sometimes more schematized. The crouching limestone figurine from the cave of Ez-Zuwitna, or the handle of a sickle from El Wad showing a fawn, are superb examples of naturalistic art, worthy of Upper Paleolithic France. In spite of the assumption of European academic archaeology that such a culture must have had links with the settlements of Old Europe, the skeletal evidence from Jericho, where the Natufian culture reached its peak, shows clearly that the inhabitants were of Eurafrican stock, fairly robust with long skulls. The ceramic evidence also favors the notion of an African origin. Occurring in the Natufian sites is dark, burnished, monochrome pottery that is known as Sahara Sudanese ware. Pottery of this type has been found near the Egyptian-Sudanese border in a situation that suggests that domesticated cattle was present, and it has been found in and near the Tassili Najir, evidently having appeared at the end of the Roundhead period. Mary Sedegast wrote, "The origin of these African ceramics is unknown. Very recent excavations of the T and Tora in the Libyan Sahara have uncovered Sahara Sudanese-type pottery with one carbon-14 reading of 7100 BC, which, if a reliable date, would suggest a Western seniority." Such statements support the notion that a high culture to the west of the Nile was the source of the new advanced culture appearing in the Nile Valley and Palestine. Of interest in this context is the Natufian culture's particularly close and intense involvement with plants. Inquiry into the relationship of environmental and behavioral systems from 10,000 to 8,000 BC reveals that the subsistence base of Natufian populations did not differ appreciably from the local Upper Paleolithic tradition. However, the emphases on plant resources in the Natufian allowed for a storable surplus which, in turn, had an effect on the Natufian behavioral patterns. Much of the Natufian material culture, architecture, grinding stones, and settlement pattern was influenced by an intensive exploitation of plant resources. African Genesis. If the source of the oldest ceramics at the Natufian sites is North African, this would suggest strongly that the Natufian source culture was the previously disrupted partnership paradise that flourished in the wetter and more western regions of the Sahara, especially the Tassili Najir. Archaeology may eventually provide the answers, but to date, no archaeology of significance has been done with these questions in mind. the Western Sahara has not been taken seriously as a possible source of the advanced culture that entered Palestine in the mid-10th millennium BC. The result of this failure is reflected in comments like the following. What is puzzling, however, is that the Palestinian sequence provides nothing at all convincing for an ancestor for the very original first stages of the Natufian. The industry which immediately precedes it is a rather uninteresting culture, having very little in common with its successor. The Natufian, in fact, makes its first appearance apparently full-grown, with no traceable roots in the past. The early Natufians in Palestine settled caves and the terraces in front of caves, and it was in precisely such situations that the rock paintings in the Tassili were done. Further excavation of the major Roundhead mural finds in the Tassili might reveal traces of the precocious civilization that is the Natufian source culture. Catalhoyuk. If the Tassili Najir can claim consideration as the original Eden and westernmost location of partnership culture, then certainly Catalhoyuk in central Anatolia must be seen as its Neolithic and Eastern culmination. Catalhoyuk has been called a premature flash of brilliance and complexity, and an immensely rich and luxurious city. The stratigraphy for the site begins in the middle of the 9th millennium BC. Elaboration of cultural forms reaches a pinnacle in Cattle Level 6 in the middle of the 7th millennium BC. Catalhoyuk was a huge settlement, spreading over 32 acres of the Konya Plain and, at its peak, accommodating over 7,000 people. Although barely begun, the excavation of Catalhoyuk has already yielded amazing shrines with cattle bas-reliefs and heads of now extinct aurochs, Bos primigenius, covered with ochre designs, the very complex paintings of a complicated civilization. Catalhoyuk's complexity has puzzled archaeologists. Less than 3% of the site has been explored, but Catalhoyuk has already yielded a wealth of religious art and symbolism that appears to be 3,000 or 4,000 years ahead of its time. The mature complexity of the traditions at this Neolithic site further presupposes, according to the excavator, an Upper Paleolithic ancestor of whom we have no trace. I contend that the Upper Paleolithic ancestor of which we have no trace is the culture of the Tassili Najir. The Natufian culture was a transitional culture directly linking the Roundhead culture in Africa with Catalhoyuk. In support of this rather startling statement, consider the following observations by other scholars. Mellart said of the agriculture at Cattle, "Everything indicates that the plant husbandry of Catalhoyuk must have a long prehistory somewhere else, in a region where the wild ancestors of these plants were at home, presumably in hilly country, well away from the man-made environment of the Konya Plain. The beginnings must be sought in the Natufian of Palestine, the still unknown earlier aceramic of the Anatolian plateau of Turkey, and in Khuzestan, farther to the east." Here is Mellart on the material culture at Cattle. In contrast to other contemporary Neolithic cultures, Catalhoyuk preserved a number of traditions that seem archaic in a fully developed Neolithic society. The art of wall painting, the reliefs modeled in clay or cut out of the wall plaster, the naturalistic representations of animals, human figures, and deities, the occasional use of finger-impressed clay designs like macaroni, the developed use of geometric ornament including spirals and meanders, incised on seals or transferred to a new medium of weaving. The modeling of animals wounded in hunting rites, the practice of red ochre burials, the archaic amulets in the form of a bird-like Steatopygus goddess, and finally, certain types of stone tools and the preference for dentalium shells and jewelry all preserve remains of an Upper Paleolithic heritage. To a greater or less extent, such archaic elements are also traceable in a number of other post-Paleolithic cultures, such as the Natufian of Palestine, but nowhere are they so pronounced as in the Neolithic of Catalhoyuk. Writing of the painted walls at Catalhoyuk, Sedagast made this observation. The range of pigments used by the cattle artists was unmatched in the Near East, although equaled or surpassed in the Roundhead art of the Sahara. A third type of decoration was accomplished by cutting out silhouettes of animals from the deep accumulations of plaster on the walls, a curious use of interior surfaces that Mellart, the excavator, believes may have been carried over from the techniques of rock art. The elegant naturalism of the art at Catalhoyuk is an echo of the beautiful and sensitive renderings of cattle that typify the Tassili art finds. Speaking of the inspired animal art of the Upper Paleolithic, Mellart writes, "We have already seen a faint survival of the naturalistic style in the Natufian of Palestine, but it was far more marked in the wall paintings and plaster engravings of the Neolithic site of Catalhoyuk. There, this naturalistic art survived until the middle of the 58th century BC, but it is no longer found in the later culture of Hassilar or Khan Hassan, cultures which followed in the same area. What could account for the vitiation of the naturalistic spirit in archaic art that accompanies the changeover from hunting-gathering to agriculture? While the absence of the inspiring mushroom and the visual acuity it imparted cannot be the sole cause, its loss may well have sapped the vitality of the archaic vision. The goddess-worshipping pastoralists saw more deeply into nature, and their naturalistic style sacrificed esoteric symbolic representation to visual realism, often of the most pristine sort. The most common motifs at Catalhoyuk are cattle and bulls, and secondarily, vultures and leopards, all animals of the African grasslands. Of the vultures, Sedagast says, "In any event, if the vulture theme did enter Catalhoyuk at level 8 with the pre-dynastic-style flint daggers and possibly Sahara-Sudanese-related ceramics, as the excavations to this point suggest, the chance that some of this Anatolian vulture symbolism was actually African cannot be ruled out." The conclusion that peoples and cultural institutions long old in Africa were entering and flourishing for a time in the Near Eastern environment is logical and difficult to avoid. Mellart is puzzled that Catalhoyuk left no great impact on subsequent cultures in the area, remarking that the Neolithic cultures of Anatolia introduced the first beginnings of agriculture and stock breeding and a cult of the mother goddess, the basis of our civilization. A basis many today still deny, it may fairly be added. Rianne Eisler, who has examined the psychology and mechanisms for maintaining cultural equilibrium in partnership society, argues convincingly that the later pattern to emerge, that of the dominator society, came with the Indo-Europeans, the horse-mounted wheeled vehicle cultures from the cold country north of the Black Sea. These are the people of the controversial and hypothetical Kurgan waves of Indo-European population movement. On this matter, Eisler's position echoes that of Maria Gimbutas, who wrote, "The term Old Europe is applied to a pre-Indo-European culture of Europe, a culture matrifocal and probably matrilinear, agricultural and sedentary, egalitarian and peaceful. It contrasted sharply with the ensuing Proto-Indo-European culture, which was patriarchal, stratified, pastoral, mobile, and war-oriented, superimposed on all Europe except the southern and western fringes, in the course of 3 waves of infiltration from the Russian steppe, between 4500 and 2500 BC. During and after this period, the female deities, or more accurately the goddess creatrix in her many aspects, were largely replaced by the predominantly male divinities of the Indo-Europeans. What developed after circa 2500 BC was a melange of the 2 mythic systems, Old European and Indo-European. Gimbutas believes, in short, that the sedentary matrilinear civilization of Old Europe was disrupted by successive waves of Indo-European invaders with a different culture and language. Cambridge archaeologist Colin Renfrew has offered an alternative interpretation of this Kurgan waves theory of Indo-European language diffusion. He claims Catalhoyuk is the point of origin of the Indo-European language group and the area most likely to be implicated in the invention of agriculture. To support his unorthodox views, Renfrew calls upon the linguistic findings of Vladislav M. Ilyich Vidich and Aaron Dolgopolsky, which also point toward Anatolia as the home of the Indo-European languages. Dolgopolsky's student Sergei Starostin has argued that about 7,000 years ago, Indo-Europeans borrowed a massive number of words from the North Caucasian language of Anatolia. The date of this borrowing argues for our conclusion that Catalhoyuk was not founded by Indo-Europeans who would have migrated there during a much later period. The recent genetic findings of Luigi Cavalli Savorza and Alan C. Wilson at Berkeley also seem to support this conclusion. The Berkeley group analyzed blood groupings of living populations and traced the population's genetic roots. They concluded that there is a close genetic relationship among the speakers of Afro-Asiatic and the Indo-European languages. Their work also supports the view that populations with linguistic roots in Africa had been living on the Anatolian plateau long before the appearance of the Indo-Europeans. The legacy of Catalhoyuk was suppressed precisely because of the culture's deep association with the mother goddess. The orgiastic, psychedelic religion that worshipped the mother goddess made the cattle culture anathema to the new dominator style of warfare and hierarchy. This was a cultural style that arrived suddenly and without warning. The domestication of the horse and discovery of the wheel allowed the Indo-European tribal populations to move south of the Zagros Mountains for the first time. Horse-mounted plunder brought the dominator style to Anatolia and trampled beneath its hooves the last great partnership civilization. Plunder replaced pastoralism, mead cults finally completed the already well-advanced process of supplanting mushroom use. Human god kings replaced the religion of the goddess. However, at its height, the cult of Catalhoyuk represented the most advanced and coherent expression of religious feeling in the world. We have very little evidence upon which to reconstruct the nature of the cult acts performed, but the sheer number of shrines in relation to the total number of rooms bespeaks a culture obsessed with religious observances. We know that this was a cult of totemic animals: the vulture, the hunting cat, and always preeminent, the bull or the cow. Later religions in the ancient Middle East were bull-worshipping in spirit, but we cannot assume this for Catalhoyuk. The sculpted heads of cattle that protrude into the cattle shrines at Catalhoyuk are sexually ambiguous and may represent bulls or cows or simply cattle generally. However, the prevalence of female symbolism in the shrines is overwhelming. For example, the breasts of sculpted stucco that are apparently randomly placed makes it seem likely that the religious officials were women. The presence of built-in recliners in some shrines suggests that curing or midwifery in a shamanic style may have been part of the rites. It is impossible not to see in the cult of the great goddess and the cattle cult of the late Neolithic a recognition of the mushroom as the third and hidden member of a kind of shamanic trinity. The mushroom, seen to be as much a product of cattle as are milk, meat, and manure, was recognized very early as the physical connection to the presence of the goddess. This is the secret that was lost some 6,000 years ago at the eclipse of Catalhoyuk. The crucial difference. I am in general agreement with Eisler's view expressed in The Chalice and the Blade, and hope only to extend her argument by asking the following question. What factor maintained the equilibrium of the partnership societies of the late Neolithic and then faded, setting the stage for the emergence of the evolutionarily maladaptive dominator model? In my thinking on this matter, I have been guided by a belief that the depth of the relationship of a human group to the gnosis of the transcendent other, the Gaian collectivity of organic life, determines the strength of the group's connection to the archetype of the goddess and hence to the partnership style of social organization. I base this assumption on observation of shamans in the Amazon and on observation of the impact of plant hallucinogens on my own psychology and that of my peers. The mainstream of Western thought ceased to be refreshed by the gnosis of the boundary-dissolving plant hallucinogens long before the close of the Minoan era, circa 850 BC. In Crete and in nearby Greece, awareness of the vegetable logos continued as an esoteric and diminished presence until the Eleusinian mysteries were finally suppressed by enthusiastic Christian barbarians in AD 268. The consequence of that severed connection is the modern world, a planet dying under moral anesthesia. Suppression of the feminine and of knowledge of the natural world has been the hallmark of the intervening centuries. The late medieval church that conducted the great witch burnings wanted all magic and derangement to be attributed to the devil. For this reason it suppressed all knowledge of plants such as thornapple, datura, deadly nightshade, and monkshood, and of the role these plants were playing in the nocturnal activities of the practitioners of witchcraft. And this role was an extensive one. Flying ointments and magical salves were compounded out of datura roots and seeds, parts of the plant rich in delirium and delusion-producing tropane alkaloids. When this material was applied to the witch's body, it produced states of extraordinary derangement and delusion. Hans Baldung's treatment of this subject leaves no doubt about the terror of the medieval mind projected on the image of intoxicated women. But in the accounts of the Inquisition, the central role of plants was never stressed. After all, the Church had no interest in a devil who is such a diminished figure that he must rely on mere herbs to work his wiles. The devil must be a worthy foe of the Christos, and hence nearly co-equal. We must assume that the role of mind-altering plants in some witches' flights was not only underemphasized, but entirely suppressed for a reason. If this had not been done, then a natural explanation for such phenomena would have suggested itself, something in fact advanced by the physicians, philosophers, and magicians quoted here, such as Porta, Weir, and Cardanus. The devil then would have been left with only a very modest significance, or none at all. If he was assigned nothing more than the role of carnival conjurer who caused mere illusions to flame up in the heads of witches, he could not have fulfilled the function assigned to him, namely the mighty enemy and seducer of Christendom. The vegetable mind. In view of our present cultural impasse, I conclude that the next evolutionary step must involve not only a repudiation of dominator culture, but an archaic revival and a rebirth of awareness of the goddess. Implicit in the ending of profane and secular history is the notion of our involvement with the re-emergence of the vegetable mind. That same mind that coaxed us into self-reflecting language now offers us the boundless landscapes of the imagination. This is the same vision of human fulfillment through the divine imagination that was presciently glimpsed by William Blake. Without such a visionary relationship to psychedelic exopheromones that regulate our symbiotic relationship with the plant kingdom, we stand outside of an understanding of planetary purpose. And understanding planetary purpose may be the major contribution that we can make to the evolutionary process. Returning to the balance of the planetary partnership style means trading the point of view of the egoistic dominator for the intuitional, feeling-toned understanding of the maternal matrix. A rethinking of the role that hallucinogenic plants and fungi have played in the promotion of human emergence from primate organization can help lead to a new appreciation of the unique confluence of factors responsible and necessary for the evolution of human beings. The widely felt intuition of the presence of the other as a goddess can be traced back to society's immersion in the vegetable mind. This sense of the female companion explains the persistent intrusion themes of the mother goddess even into the most patriarchal domains. The persistence of the cult of Mary in Christianity is a case in point, as is the fervor reserved for the cult of Kali, the destroying mother, and the idea of the divine Purusha in Hinduism. The anima mundi, the soul of the world, of Hermetic thought, is another image of the goddess of the world. Ultimately, all of these female images are reducible to the archetype of the original vegetable mind. Immersion in the psychedelic experience provided the ritual context in which human consciousness emerged into the light of self-awareness, self-reflection, and self-articulation, into the light of Gaia, the earth herself. Gaian holism. Deconstruction of dominator cultural values means promotion of what may be called a sense of Gaian holism, that is, a sense of the unity and balance of nature and of our own position within that dynamic, evolving balance. It is a plant-based view. This return to a perspective on self and ego that places them within the larger context of planetary life and evolution is the essence of the archaic revival. Marshall McLuhan was correct to see that planetary human culture, the global village, would be tribal in character. The next great step toward a planetary holism is the partial merging of the technologically transformed human world with the archaic matrix of vegetable intelligence that is the transcendent other. I hesitate to characterize this dawning awareness as religious, yet that is what it surely is. And it will involve a full exploration of the dimensions revealed by plant hallucinogens, especially those structurally related to neurotransmitters already present in the human brain. Careful exploration of the plant hallucinogens will probe the most archaic and sensitive level of the drama of the emergence of consciousness, the plant-human quasi-symbiotic relationship that characterized archaic society and religion, and through which the numinous mystery was originally experienced. And this experience is no less mysterious for us today, in spite of the general assumption that we have replaced the simple awe of our ancestors with philosophical and epistemic tools of the utmost sophistication and analytical power. Now our choice as a planetary culture is a simple one: go green or die. Part 2. Paradise Lost. Chapter 7. Searching for Soma, the Golden Vedic Enigma. Our present global crisis is more profound than any previous historical crises, hence our solutions must be more drastic. Plants and a renewal of our archaic relationship with plants could serve as the organizational model for life in the 21st century, just as the computer operates as the dominant model of the late 20th century. We need to think back to the last sane moment that we as a species ever knew, and then act from the premises that were in place at that moment. This means reaching back in time to models that were successful 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. This shift in viewpoint would enable us to see plants as more than food, shelter, clothing, or even sources of education and religion. They would become models of process. They are, after all, the exemplars of symbiotic connectedness and efficient resource recycling and management. If we acknowledge that archaic revival will be a paradigm transformation and that we really can create a caring, refeminized, eco-sensitive world by going back to very old models, then we must admit that more than political exhortation will be needed. To be effective, the archaic revival must rest on an experience that shakes each and every one of us to our very roots. The experience must be real, generalized, and discussable. We can begin this restructuring of thought by declaring legitimate what we have denied for so long. Let us declare nature to be legitimate. The notion of illegal plants is obnoxious and ridiculous in the first place. Contacting the mind behind nature. The last best hope for dissolving the steep walls of cultural inflexibility that appear to be channeling us toward true ruin is renewed shamanism. By re-establishing channels of direct communication with the other, the mind behind nature, through the use of hallucinogenic plants, we will obtain a new set of lenses to see our way in the world. When the medieval world grew moribund in its worldview, secularized European society sought salvation in the revivifying of classical Greek and Roman approaches to law, philosophy, aesthetics, city planning, and agriculture. Our dilemma, being deeper, will cast us further back into time in a search for answers. We need to examine the visionary intoxicants of our collective past, which include the strange cult of Soma, described in the earliest Indo-European spiritual writings. No history of plants and peoples could claim completeness without a thorough treatment of the mysterious Soma cult of the ancient Indo-Europeans. As mentioned in Chapter 6, the Indo-Europeans were a nomadic people whose original home has been a matter of scholarly debate and who are associated with patriarchy, wheeled chariots, and the domestication of the horse. Also associated with the Indo-Europeans is a religion based on the magnificently intoxicating Soma. Soma was a juice or sap pressed out of the swollen fibers of a plant that was also called Soma. The text seemed to imply that the juice was purified by being poured through a woolen filter, and then in some cases was mixed with milk. Again and again, and in various ways, we find Soma intimately connected with the symbolism and rituals related to cattle and pastoralism. As will be discussed, the identity of Soma is not known. We believe this connection to cattle is central to any attempt to identify Soma. The earliest scriptural writings of these Indo-European people are the Vedas. Of these, the best known is the Rig Veda, best described as a collection of nearly 120 hymns to Soma, the plant and the god. Indeed, the 9th mandala of the Rig Veda is entirely composed of a paean of praise for the magical plant. The beginning of the 9th mandala is typical of the praises of Soma that pervade and typify Indo-European literature of the period. Thy juices, purified Soma, all-pervading, swift as thought, go of themselves like the offspring of swift mares, the celestial, well-winged, sweet-flavored juices, great exciters of exhilaration, alight upon the receptacle. Thy exhilarating, all-pervading juices are let loose separately like chariot horses. The sweet-flavored Soma waves go to Indra, the wielder of the thunderbolt, as a cow with milk to the calf. Like a horse urged on to do battle, do thou who art all-knowing rush from heaven to the receptacle whose mother is the cloud. Purified Soma, thy celestial steed-like streams, as quick as thought, are pouring along with the milk into the receptacle. The Rishis, the ordainers of sacrifice, who cleanse thee, O Rishi, enjoyed Soma, pour thy continuous streams into the midst of the vessel. Soma was prominent in the pre-Zoroastrian religion of Iran as Homa. Soma and Homa are different forms of the same word, derived from a root meaning to squeeze out liquid, which is su in Sanskrit and hu in Avestan. No praise seems to have been too excessive to be applied to the magical intoxicant. Soma was thought to have been brought by an eagle from the highest heaven, or from the mountains where it had been placed by Varuna, a member of the early Hindu pantheon. Here is another quote from Rig Veda. It is drunk by the sick man as medicine at sunrise. Partaking of it strengthens the limbs, preserves the legs from breaking, wards off all disease, and lengthens life. Then need and trouble vanish away. Pinching want is driven off and flees when the inspiring one lays hold of the mortal. The poor man, in the intoxication of the Soma, feels himself rich. The draught impels the singer to lift his voice and inspires him for song. It gives the poet supernatural power, so that he feels himself immortal. On account of this inspiring power of the drink, There arose, even in the Indo-Iranian period, a personification of the sap as the god Soma, and ascription to him of almost all the deeds of other gods, the strength of the gods even being increased by this draught. Like Agni, Soma causes his radiance to shine cheeringly in the waters. Like Vayu, he drives on with his steeds. Like the Akvins, he comes in haste with aid when summoned. Like Pusan, he excites reverence, watches over the herds, and leads by the shortest roads to success. Like Indra, as the sought-for ally, he overcomes all enemies near and far, frees from the evil intentions of the envious, from danger and want, brings goodly riches from heaven, from earth and the air. Soma too makes the sun rise in the heavens, restores what has been lost, has 1,000 ways and means of help, heals all, blind and lame, chases away the black skin, aborigines, and gives everything into the possession of the pious Arya. In his, the world ruler's, ordinances these lands stand. He, the bearer of heaven and the prop of earth, holds all people in his hand. Bright shining as Mitra, awe-compelling as Aryaman, he exults and gleams like Surya. Varuna's commands are his commands. He too measures the earth's spaces and built the vault of the heavens. Like him, he too, full of wisdom, guards the community, watches over men even in hidden places, knows the most secret things. He will lengthen the life of the devout endlessly, and after death make him immortal in the place of the blessed, in the highest heaven. Soma. What is it? A crucial question arises in any discussion of this powerful plant on whose ecstatic visions all later Hindu religiosity is based. What was the botanical identity of Soma, the pillar of the world? In the 19th century, this question was nearly impossible to frame. The state of comparative philology was too rudimentary, and there was little impulse to adopt an interdisciplinary approach to the problem. Sanskritists did not talk to botanists, and neither talked to pharmacologists. In fact, to the 19th century, the question was uninteresting, rather like asking, "What song did the sirens sing?" or "Where is Troy?" Thanks to the discoveries of Heinrich Schliemann, who followed his own inner voices and promptings, it is generally agreed that we now know where Troy actually stood. And in that spirit of respect for the factual veracity of ancient texts, 20th century scholarship has attempted to decipher the botanical identity of Soma. These attempts have ranged from the casual to the exhaustive. The game is precisely the sort that scholars love to play. The answers must be contained in fragmented descriptions in a long-dead language filled with color words and words which only occur once in the literature of a given language. What plant best fits the scattered references to the physical form of this most mysterious member of the visionary flora? To answer this question, we must try to reconstruct the context in which the Indo-Europeans found themselves. One possibility is that the migrations, beginning sometime during the 6th millennium BC, carried the Indo-European tribes far beyond the forest environment suitable to the source of archaic Soma. Of course, events would have unfolded slowly. The archaic Soma must have been an item of trade between the original homelands of the Aryans and the frontiers of their southeastward expanding sphere of influence. Another possibility is that Soma was something that the Indo-Europeans did not come in contact with until they encountered the valley-dwelling pastoralists who presumably used mushrooms and who lived on the Konya plain of Anatolia. In either case, and over time, as linguistic differences arose, as trade routes became ever longer, and as local substitutes for Soma were experimented with, and the local traditions of conquered people assimilated, the original identity of Soma became mingled with myth. Progressively more esoteric, it became a secret teaching, delivered orally and known but to a few, until finally it was forgotten. The preparation of visionary Soma seems to be something that faded as the Indo-European migration ceased, at a time when reform and revitalization movements were being strongly felt in Persia, as well as on the subcontinent of India. Homa and Zoroaster. Perhaps the disappearance of Soma occurred because the newly reform-minded religion of Zoroaster, established circa 575 BC, then holding sway on the Iranian plateau, had chosen to take a repressive approach to the ancient sacrament of godlike empowerment. Zoroaster told of Ahura Mazda, a supreme creator who creates through his own Holy Spirit and who rules over a world divided between truth and lies. The creatures of Ahura Mazda are free and thus responsible for their destiny. The outward symbol of truth is fire, and the fire altar is the center of Zoroastrian cultic practice. But as the following makes clear, the old allure of Soma was difficult to suppress. There are only 2 references to Homa, Soma in the Gathas, or sacred verses of Zoroaster, one mentioning Duro Eosa, averter of death, and the other alluding to the filthiness of this intoxicant. These allusions are sufficient to prove that the intoxicating Homa was under the ban of the Great Reformer. But in the later Avesta, sacred book of Zoroastrianism, Homa, like so many of the other old Daivas, gods, came back again, and according to Yasna 9-10, was in almost every respect the same as the Vedic Soma. Indeed, Zoroaster may not have actually intended to ban Homa. Perhaps Zoroaster was merely objecting to the sacrifice of bulls, which was part of the rite. Bull sacrifice would certainly be anathema to anyone who is aware of the connection between cattle and mushrooms in the old religion of the great goddess. R.C. Zahner argues persuasively that Zoroaster never abolished the Homa rite. In the Yasna, the Homa is prepared for the satisfaction of the righteous Fravashi of Zoroaster. It is, of course, quite true that the Zoroastrians of what we have called the Catholic period brought back a vast amount of pagan material from the older national religion. So far as we can tell, the Homa rite has been the central liturgical act of Zoroastrianism ever since that religion developed liturgical worship. And the central position it enjoys has never at any time been disputed. This is, however, not true of animal sacrifice. In later times, this was practiced by some but opposed by others. What clues are there that might guide us in the search for a botanical identity for Soma? In both the Veda and Avesta, the Soma plant is described as having hanging branches and a yellow color. Its mountain origin is also generally agreed upon. Soma substitutes had to be found once the tradition was forced underground on the Iranian plateau. Presumably, substitutes chosen would be similar in appearance to the original Soma plant. It is also probable that the technical terms of the ritual would be retained, even if the substitute plant did not correspond perfectly to Soma. Since the Soma rite was the essence of Vedic ritual, 3 daily pressings were necessary to worship the gods, which means large amounts of the plant would have been required. But most important, no plant could substitute for Soma if it were not itself an ecstatic visionary intoxicant worthy of being described in such extravagant terms as these. Where there is eternal light, in the world where the sun is placed, in that immortal, imperishable world place me, O Soma. Where life is free, in the 3rd heaven of heavens, where the worlds are radiant, there make me immortal. Where there is happiness and delight, where joy and pleasure reside, where the desires of our desire are attained, there make me immortal. Homa and Harmala. Attempts to identify Soma have led to heated debates about, for example, the precise meaning of certain color words in the Vedic descriptions. Soma has been identified variously as an ephedra, a plant related to the plant that is the source of the stimulant ephedrine, a sarcostemma, a relative of the American milkweeds, cannabis, and a leafless climber of the genus Paraploca. It has also been identified as fermented mare's milk, fermented honey, or a mixture of these and other substances. Recently, Paganum Harmala, the giant Syrian rue, which contains psychoactive substances, has been argued for very persuasively by David Flattery and Martin Schwartz in their intriguing book Homa and Harmala. They contend that the original identification of Vedic Soma with Syrian rue by Sir William Jones in 1794 was correct. They make their argument using the Zend Avesta and other scriptural materials of the Parsi religion that other scholars had passed over. In discussing the ordinarily invisible spiritual world of the after-death state called Menog existence in the Avestan religion, Flattery says this: the consumption of Soma, may have been the only means recognized in Iranian religion of seeing into Menog existence before death. At all events, it is the only means acknowledged in Zoroastrian literature, and as we have seen, is the means used by Ormazd when he wishes to make the Menog existence visible to living persons. In ancient Iranian religion, there is little evidence of concern with meditative practice, which might foster development of alternative, non-pharmacological means to such vision. In Iran, vision into the spirit world was not thought to come about simply by divine grace or as a reward for saintliness. From the apparent role of Soma in initiation rites, experience of the effects of Soma, which is to say vision of Menog existence, must have at one time been required of all priests, or the shamans antecedent to them. The Wasson's Amanita Theory. Gordon and Valentina Wasson, the founders of the science of ethnomycology, the study of human uses of and lore concerning mushrooms and other fungi, first suggested that Soma might be a mushroom, specifically that it was the scarlet-capped, white-spotted fly agaric, Amanita muscaria, an extremely ancient shamanic intoxicant until recently used by the Tungusic tribes of Arctic Siberia. The evidence that the Wassons gathered was massive. By studying the evolution of the languages involved, tracing artistic motifs, and judiciously re-examining and reinterpreting the Vedic material, they made a strong case that a mushroom lay behind the mystery of Soma. Theirs was the first botanically sophisticated, pharmacologically informed inquiry into the identity of Soma. In other research, the Wassons discovered the existence of still-active shamanic mushroom cults in the mountains of the Sierra Mazateca of Oaxaca, Mexico. Gordon Wasson brought samples of Mexican mushrooms to Swiss pharmaceutical chemist and LSD discoverer Albert Hofmann, and thus set the stage for the characterization and isolation of psilocybin in 1957. The same psilocybin that I argue was involved in the emergence of human self-reflection on the African grasslands some tens of millennia ago. In 1971, Gordon Wasson published Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality. There the case for fly agaric is presented in its most complete form. Wasson was brilliant in advancing the notion that a mushroom of some sort was implicated in the Soma mystery. He was less successful in showing that the species behind the mystery was the fly agaric. He, like all those before him who had attempted an identification of Soma, had forgotten that whatever Soma was, it was a visionary intoxicant of tremendous power and an unparalleled hallucinogen. In contrast, he was well aware that European scholarship had settled upon Siberian shamanism as exemplary of all archaic shamanism, and that fly agaric had long been used in Siberia to induce shamanic journeys and initiate neophyte shamans into the fullness of their heritage. As a result of Wasson's own discoveries in Mexico, it was known that mushrooms other than fly agaric could contain visionary intoxicants, but psilocybin mushrooms were thought to be a strictly New World phenomenon, since no other intoxicating mushrooms were known. Wasson assumed that if a mushroom were Soma, then that mushroom must be a fly agaric. This overemphasis of Amanita muscaria has haunted efforts to understand Soma ever since. Objections to fly agaric. Genetically and chemically, Amanita muscaria is extremely variable. Many kinds of fly agaric do not provide a reliable ecstatic experience. Soil considerations and geographic and seasonal factors also affect its hallucinogenic properties. Use of a plant by a shaman does not necessarily mean it is ecstatic. Many rather unpleasant plants are used by shamans to intoxicate themselves and to open the crack between the worlds. Among these are the daturas, relatives of jimsonweed, the arborescent brugmansias, whose pendulous blossoms are familiar as landscaping ornamentals, bright red and black Sephora secundifolia seeds, Brunfelsia, and Viola-based snuffs made of powdered tree resin. In spite of their shamanic usage, these plants do not induce an ecstatic experience that could inspire the rapturous praise heaped on Soma. Wasson himself was aware that Amanita was unreliable, as he himself never had an ecstatic experience from eating Amanita. Instead of realizing that Amanita muscaria was an unlikely candidate for Vedic Soma, Wasson became convinced that some method of preparation must have been involved. But no ingredient or procedure has ever been found that reliably transforms the often uncomfortable subtoxic experience of Amanita into visionary journeying to a magical paradise. Wasson himself knew of only one inexplicable and unreplicated exception. In 1965 and again in 1966, we tried out the fly agarics, Amanita muscaria, repeatedly on ourselves. The results were disappointing. We ate them raw on empty stomachs. We drank the juice on empty stomachs. We mixed the juice with milk and drank the mixture, always on empty stomachs. We felt nauseated and some of us threw up. We felt disposed to sleep and fell into a deep slumber from which shouts could not rouse us, lying like logs, not snoring, dead to the outside world. When in this state, I once had vivid dreams, but nothing like what happened when I took the psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico, where I did not sleep at all. In our experiments at Sugadaira, Japan, there was one occasion that differed from the others, one that could be called successful. Rokuya Imazaki took his mushrooms with miso shiru, the delectable soup that the Japanese usually serve for breakfast, and he toasted his mushroom caps on a fork before an open fire. When he rose from the sleep that comes with the mushroom, he was in full elation. For 3 hours he could not help but speak. He was a compulsive speaker. The purport of his remarks was that this was nothing like the alcoholic state. It was infinitely better, beyond all comparison. We did not know at the time why, on this single occasion, our friend Imazaki was affected this way. The chemical compounds active in Amanita muscaria are muscarine and muscimol. Muscarine is highly toxic, and like most cholinergic poisons, its activity is reversed by injection of atropine sulfate. Muscimol, the likely candidate for the psychoactivity of the mushroom, has been described as merely an emetic and a sedative. Human exposure to muscimol is not described in the literature. Incredibly, the obvious step of giving muscimol to human beings to determine its psychedelic potential, if any, has not been undertaken. This fact again points out the queasy illogic that overtakes the academic mentality in the presence of questions revolving around self-induced changes in consciousness. To the preceding, let me add my own personal experience of the fly agaric. I have ingested it on 2 occasions. Once the specimens were a dried collection made at sea level in Northern California. My experience of 5 dried grams was one of nausea, salivation, and blurred vision. Drifting images were present with eyes closed, but of a trivial and unengaging sort. My second exposure was a dinner plate-sized fresh specimen collected at 10,000 feet in the mountains behind Boulder, Colorado. In this case, salivation and stomach cramps were the only effects. Finally, here's part of an account of fly agaric intoxication by an extremely sophisticated subject, a professional psychotherapist and neurophysiologist. The dose taken was 1 cup of finely chopped mushroom. The mushrooms came from the Pecos River drainage of New Mexico. I was occasionally twitching, a gleam of perspiration over me, saliva dribbling rapidly out of my mouth. I did not know how the time passed. Thought I was awake or dreaming dreams that were totally lifelike, dreamed in total awareness. I was only dimly or not at all aware of the music being played. Threw off my blanket, very hot, sweaty, very cold-chilled but no visible chills. It seemed unusually quiet inside. I was very stoned. Unlike anything I had felt before, psychedelic is too broad a term, too all-encompassing. It was not truly psychedelic. It was as if everything were exactly the same but totally unfamiliar, but it all looked like I knew it to be. Except that this world was about a shade or a quantum level off, different in an eerie, profound, and unmistakable way. I was ataxic, unable to coordinate voluntary movements, and euphoric. There was very little visual stuff. In short, Amanita muscaria is doubtless an effective shamanic vehicle in the floristically limited Arctic environment in which it has been traditionally utilized as a psychoactive agent. But the rapturous visionary ecstasy that inspired the Vedas, and was the central mystery of the Indo-European peoples as they moved across the Iranian plateau, could not possibly have been caused by Amanita muscaria. Wasson, his contradictions and other fungal candidates for Soma. Wasson remained convinced that fly agaric was Soma. In his last book, Persephone's Quest, published posthumously, he characterized fly agaric as the supreme entheogen of all time, apparently on faith, since he admitted it was disappointing and only reported attaining shamanic ecstasy by using Psilocybin, which he never introduces into the Soma puzzle. However, he did introduce an interesting caveat when writing of India. Other fungal entheogens grow at the lower levels. They come in cattle dung, are easily identified and gathered, and are effective, but they fail to conform to the Brahmanic practices. They are known to tribals and sudras, untouchables. Soma, on the other hand, exacts self-discipline of the priests, a long initiation and training. It is for proper exploitation, an affair of the priestly elite. But the possible role of Stropharia cubensis, growing in the dung of cattle in the lives of the lower orders, remains to this day wholly unexplored. Is S. cubensis responsible for the elevation of the cow to a sacred status, and for the inclusion of the urine and dung of cows in the Pankagavya, the Vedic sacrifice? And was that a contributing reason for abandoning Soma? Given the ecological conditions prevailing in the Indus Valley and Kashmir, only a few of the Indo-Europeans could know by personal experience the secret of the divine herb. The cult of Soma must have been shaped by the peculiar circumstances prevailing in the area, but ultimately those circumstances must have doomed that cult. Today it lives on in India only as an intense and glowing memory of an ancient rite. In discussing the prohibition against eating mushrooms if one is a Brahmin, a prohibition established in the late Vedic phase, Wasson says, "We still do not know. We will probably never know when the prescription came into force, perhaps over centuries while the Vedic hymns were being composed, or possibly when the hierarchs among the Brahmins learned of the entheogenic virtues of Stropharia cubensis as known to the lower orders living in India." Something unusual is going on in these two passages. A great scholar, himself quite a Brahmin, an investment banker by profession, and an honorary fellow of Harvard University, seems to be behaving in a most unscholarly manner. We know from his own eloquent descriptions that Wasson experienced the ecstasy of Psilocybin on more than one occasion. And we know that he never obtained a satisfying experience from Amanita muscaria. Yet in these passages he dismisses, ignores, and passes over ample evidence that the mushroom that lay behind the mystery of Soma was the psilocybin-rich Stropharia cubensis. He calls it easily identified and effective, but cannot conceive that it could be the Soma he seeks. He asks himself whether Stropharia cubensis could have been a contributing reason for abandoning Soma. Then he ignores his own question. If Soma is Stropharia cubensis, then the tradition could be traced unbroken back to prehistoric Africa. Twice in these two passages he refers to the lower orders, a break with his usual egalitarianism. My contention is that many considerations, some of them unconscious, shaped Wasson's words as he formulated his last statement on the problem that had consumed most of his life. Those who knew Wasson knew that he had a tremendous aversion to hippies, and that he was deeply troubled by the events that unfolded in Oaxaca after he published his findings on the mushroom cults that survive there. The predictable migration of adventurers, spiritual seekers, young people, and sensationalists that followed upon Wasson's revelations of the mushroom cults made him bitter and offensive on the subject of psychedelic culture. "I have often taken the sacred mushrooms, but never for a kick or for recreation. Knowing as I did from the outset the lofty regard in which they are held by those who believe in them, I would not, could not, so profane them." Following my article in Life, a mob of thrillmongers seeking the magic mushroom descended on Huautla de Jimenez. Hippies, self-styled psychiatrists, oddballs, even tour leaders with their docile flocks, many accompanied by their malls. Countless thousands elsewhere have taken the mushrooms or the synthetic pills containing their active agent, and the chatter of some of them fills the nether reaches of one segment of our free press. I deplore this activity of the riffraff of our population, but what else could we have done? Wasson maintained a position of stern disapproval of hedonistic use of his beloved entheogens, a clumsy word freighted with theological baggage that he preferred to the common term psychedelic. Perhaps it was this attitude that caused Wasson to decide that his magnum opus, written in collaboration with the French mycologist Roger Heim, Les Champignons hallucinogènes du Mexique, should not be made available in the 1960s in an English translation. There could have been a host of reasons, of course. The fact remains that Wasson's most important work is his only work not available in English. Paganum Harmala as Soma. In fairness to Wasson, it must be said that he assumed that Stropharia cubensis was first encountered by the Indo-Europeans when they reached India, and thus that it entered the Soma equation rather late. My own contention is that Stropharia cubensis, or a conspecific coprophilic species, was well established in Africa, Anatolia, and perhaps the Iranian plateau, millennia before the coming of the Indo-Europeans. This assumption changes the picture in important ways. It means that the invading Indo-European tribes encountered old mushroom-using cultures already in place on the Anatolian and Iranian plateaus. The increasing dryness of the region could possibly have prompted a search for mushroom substitutes long before the Indo-European invasions. I confess to being impressed by the new data on harmaline put forth by Flattery and Schwartz, arguing conclusively that, at least by late Vedic times, Homa Soma was understood to be Paganum Harmala. Harmaline, the beta-carboline present in Paganum Harmala, is distinct in its pharmacological activity from harmine, its near relative which occurs in the South American ayahuasca plant Banisteriopsis caapi. It is known that harmaline is more psychoactive and less toxic than harmine. This may mean that Paganum Harmala by itself, when brewed to sufficient strength, can give a reliable and ecstatic hallucinogenic experience. It certainly would be true that Paganum Harmala in combination with Psilocybin in any form would synergize and enhance the effects of Psilocybin. Perhaps when mushroom supplies were low, this combination was used. Gradually, Paganum Harmala might have come to supplant the ever-rarer mushrooms altogether. Here is an area where further research is clearly called for. Whatever the ultimate ethnopharmacological importance assigned to Paganum Harmala, it is clear that before the Indo-European invasion, the cultures of Anatolia and Iran were of the Catalhoyuk type. They were cattle-raising, great goddess-worshipping partnership societies practicing an orgiastic and psychedelic religion, the roots of which reach back toward Neolithic Africa and the emergence of self-reflecting consciousness. Soma as male moon god. The 9th mandala of the Rig Veda goes into great detail concerning Soma and states that Soma stands above the gods. Soma is the supreme entity. Soma is the moon. Soma is masculine. Here we have a rare phenomenon, a male lunar deity. It is limited to certain North American Indian peoples and to the Indo-Europeans. The German folk conception of the moon as masculine to this day. In studying folklore, the connection between the feminine and the moon is so deep and obvious that a lunar male deity stands out, making its traditional history in any region easy to trace. In the mythologies of the Near East, there is a lunar god that must have been imported to India from the West. The Babylonian civilization's northernmost outpost was the city of Haran, a city traditionally associated with the original home of Abraham and the beginning of astrology. The patron deity of Haran was a male moon god, Sin or Nanar. He was thought to have arisen from a god of nomads and a protector of cattle related to the masculine cult of the moon god in early Arabia. His daughter Ishtar in time overshadowed all the other female deities, as did her counterpart Isis in Egypt. As the father or source of the goddess, it is fitting that Sin wears headgear suggestive of a mushroom. No other deity in the Babylonian pantheon has this headgear. I found 3 examples of Sin or Nanar on cylinder seals. In each, the headgear was prominent, and in one instance, the accompanying text by a 19th century scholar mentioned that this headgear was in fact the identifier for the god. Why was the Haran patron deity connected with a mushroom perceived as male? This is a problem for folklorists and mythologists. Yet it is clear that the Stropharia cubensis mushroom will take the projection of masculinity or femininity with equal ease. It is obviously connected to the moon. It has a lustrous silvery appearance in certain forms, and the overnight appearance of mushrooms in a field implies that they are active at night when the moon rules the heavens. On the other hand, one can shift the point of view and suddenly see mushroom as masculine. It is solar in color, phallic in appearance, and imparts a great energy, being traditionally thought of as the child of lightning. The mushroom is most correctly seen as an androgynous shape-shifting deity, which can take various forms depending on the predisposition of the culture encountering it. One can almost say that it is a mirror of classical expectations, and so for the Indo-Europeans took on a masculine quality, and in Saharan Africa and at Catalhoyuk a very lunar and feminine quality. In any case, it is a hallucinogen or a god that is not wild, that is associated with the domestication of animals and with human culture. Soma and cattle. The domestication of the mushroom can serve as the thread to specifically connect the dung-loving Stropharia cubensis mushrooms to Soma. That cattle are a major motif in the Soma cult makes little if any sense if one believes that Soma is Amanita muscaria. Wasson noted the association of cattle and Soma, but went to some lengths to avoid the logical conclusion that Soma must be a dung-loving species. So much emphasis is laid on cows in the Rig Veda and on the urine of bulls in the religion of the Parsis that the question naturally presents itself whether cows consume the fly agaric and whether they are affected by it, along with their urine and milk. I cannot answer this. Some 18 years later, Carl A.P. Ruck, in his contribution to Wasson's last published work, commented on the preceding passage in a footnote. Metaphors of cattle are also attributes of Soma, which can be described as an udder that yields the entheogenic milk and as a bellowing bull, the latter being apparently a characteristic of the mushroom that Perseus picked at Mycenae. The bull is the most common metaphor for Soma, and this manifestation of the sacred plant may underlie the tradition that Zeus, in establishing European civilization, abducted the Anatolian Europea by appearing to her in the form of a bull that breathed upon her the inspiration of the flower he had grazed upon. In order to save the hypothesis that Amanita muscaria is Soma, these authors have seized on the fact that the urine of reindeer and human beings who have eaten Amanita muscaria is itself a psychoactive material. Among the Siberian tribes where this fact was noted, the urine is preferred over the plant itself. But Amanita muscaria does not grow in grasslands, and cattle do not habitually graze on mushrooms, nor is there any reason to believe that if they did, their urine would have psychoactive properties, as the hallucinogens would probably have been metabolized. Wasson's doubts. Wasson himself was not as certain as his published statements might seem to indicate. In 1977, Wasson wrote the following in answer to my inquiry concerning the Stropharia versus Amanita question. Your question about Stropharia cubensis has also bothered me. When Roger Heim and I went to India in 1967, in the Simlipal hills of Orissa, I was given an account of a mushroom growing in cow's dung that tallied perfectly with Stropharia cubensis, even to its psychoactive powers. My informant said that everyone avoided it. He seemed not to be withholding anything. He said he would deliver the mushroom to us, but though we stayed there a couple more days, I saw no more of him. Our purpose in going to India was altogether different. It will be necessary to pursue Stropharia cubensis further not only in India, but elsewhere in the world. Of course, Stropharia cubensis must flourish in India. Did it play a part in the abandonment of Soma? Inebriation from Stropharia cubensis and the other Psilocybin species is clearly, in my opinion, superior to Amanita muscaria. I may develop this as one of several further ideas that I propose to include in my book next after this one, which I am now drawing to a close. Eventually, however, Wasson contradicted this position. A more plausible argument. As the arguments for Amanita being Soma are quite tortured, I believe the idea is best abandoned. The web of textual and linguistic associations that was so convincing to some can probably not be saved. Nevertheless, a more plausible reconstruction might run as follows. In their original homeland north of the Black Sea, the Indo-Europeans might well have practiced a shamanic religion with close similarities to the Amanita-using shamanism characteristic of the Koryak, Chukchi, and the Kamchadal peoples of northeast Siberia. The Indo-Europeans were at that time surrounded to the north and the east by the Finno-Ugric peoples with a presumed long history of fly agaric use. In the 6th millennium BC, settled agricultural populations had already been present in Europe over 2,000 years, and urban civilizations were already ancient in the fertile river valleys of the Near East and the Anatolian plain. Sometime in this millennium, the first extensive Indo-European colonization of the Asian steppes and desert areas began. On the Eurasian steppes north of the Black Sea, the Caucasus and the Taurus and the Zagros Mountains, the horse provided the key. If the domestication of cattle in Africa had set the stage for mushroom-using, goddess-worshipping partnership societies, among the Indo-Europeans the domestication of the horse reinforced mobility, male dominance, and a social economy based on rape and plunder. Wheeled vehicles, first invented on the fringes of the Caucasus where woodland and steppe meet, soon spread among the Indo-European tribes. With horse and chariot, they began moving west into the zone of established farming groups, east into Central Asia, and south toward Lake Van, where they encountered the urban cultures of the Anatolian and Iranian plateaus. These were cultures long in place and connected to a past that reached south and west, to the cradle of consciousness in temperate African grasslands. Use of psilocybin was a folk practice as old as these cultures themselves. The Indo-Europeans. Whatever relationship the Indo-Europeans may have had to Amanita in their region of origin, it is most reasonable to suppose that the Vedas were written during the long centuries of their migrations toward the Indian subcontinent. These were centuries during which the Indo-Europeans subjugated and assimilated the valley pastoralists whom they conquered. From their contact with these cultures, the Indo-Europeans for the first time encountered the miracle of Soma and the awesome power in psilocybin. And while the Great Mother Goddess was suppressed in favor of the early Vedic pantheon, and the partnership pattern was replaced by male dominance and patriarchy, still what was retained, exalted, and deified during the nomadic phase was the mushroom, now become Soma, thunderbolt of Indra. And though in earlier chapters I argued for psilocybin use in prehistoric Africa and Asia Minor, the evidence for this position is pictorial and circumstantial. It is not yet direct. A remarkable 2,500-year-old vessel with 2 grinning anthropomorphic mushrooms embossed on its surface found in Anatolia suggests that physical evidence of Middle Eastern mushroom use may soon emerge. Small mushroom-shaped objects carved from green stone have been found in Yugoslavia as well. As climatic conditions changed, and as the Indo-Europeans migrated farther and farther east, it is likely that the mild temperatures and grassland conditions required by Stropharia cubensis ceased to be available. Other mushrooms may have enjoyed use as Soma substitutes, and of these, Amanita muscaria may have been preferred because of its availability in colder climes, its psychoactivity, however ambiguous, and its striking appearance. There are a number of possible problems with this theory. Primary among them is the lack of confirmation of the presence in India of Stropharia cubensis or other psilocybin-containing mushrooms. Amanita muscaria is also rare in India. I predict, however, that a careful search of the flora of India will reveal Stropharia cubensis as a common indigenous component of the biome of the subcontinent. The desertification of the entire area from North Africa to the region around Delhi has distorted our conception of what occurred when ancient civilizations were in their infancy and the area received higher rainfall. The psilocybin mushroom religion, born at the birth of cognition in the grasslands of Africa, may actually be the generic religion of human beings. All later adumbrations of religion in the ancient Near East can be traced to a cult of goddess and cattle worship, whose archaic roots reach back to an extremely ancient rite of ingestion of psilocybin mushrooms to induce ecstasy, dissolve the boundaries of the ego, and reunite the worshipper with the personified vegetable matrix of planetary life.